Okay, so I'm David. My background is as a writer, and my education was very traditional for a writer. I studied English at university. I read a lot of books. It was all books. It was all poetry. It was novels, the occasional play. Everything I studied had to be from before the Second World War. Very old-fashioned, very print-based education. So when I was becoming a writer, that's what I knew. I thought stories were just words on paper, and that was about it. And that was the only way they could work. When I left university and I realized that the only thing I was qualified to become was a poet, I had to start adjusting my expectations and my boundaries for what a story could be. And very quickly, the thing that I fell into was actually theatre. One of the most powerful uh, emotional media experiences of my life was going to a Punch Drunk show. Punch Drunk are a fantastic immersive theatre company you might have heard of. And one of the actors kind of cornered me and whispered this monologue into my ear, and it was incredibly powerful. And I can't remember a word of what she said, but I came away from it shaking, and it was emotionally really kind of strong. And I realized I wanted more of that kind of thing in my own work. So when I started writing plays, I was on the Young Writers Program at the Royal Court Theatre, which was a fantastic sort of theatre building in London. And their Young Writers Program was a great education. But what I realized during that education was actually, I don't like theatre in theatres that much. What I like, what got me most was performances that were site-specific or very immersive, things that completely surrounded you rather than just sitting you in a seat and you were looking through a proscenium arch at the action. So I started making immersive theatre shows. And that might start with something as simple as a guy at a campfire telling you a story, and then it would expand from there. Or I did another show called The Seed as part of the 2012 Cultural Olympiad here in London. And that was set in a forest at night. And there was one scene where the entire audience had to basically run across the battlefield with lights flashing and big whiz bangs going off around them. And it was incredibly emotionally powerful. I mean, I don't care how big and strong you are. If you're walking through a forest on your own at night, or if there's explosions going off around you, that has a very direct, emotional, visceral impact on you. And so basically through all of this, I realized that when it comes to storytelling, words aren't half the story. Words are really, they're the kind of the intellectual routes to getting to people, but there is also a much more emotional route, and that is more direct and arguably more memorable. You know, I can't remember a word of that monologue that I got from Punch Drunk, but I can certainly remember the experience of it. So it got me thinking about how stories work generally. And I work a lot in video games. And so I started looking at actually my favorite games. And I started to realize that the ones I enjoyed most, and in fact, the stories I enjoyed most, were often the ones with the least words in them. So there's a fantastic games company called That Game Company, which gets a bit confusing when you try and Google it. And they've made a couple of great games, one called Flower, one called Journey, which are beautiful stories told without any dialogue at all. And looking at their work, I was able to see, you know, without the distraction of words and characters too much in there, the basic story structure in emotional terms. That game company's production process begins with them starting with the question of what emotion do we want to produce in the audience? And that's a really good place to start, I think, for almost any creative endeavor. How do you want people to feel? And Flower is actually a really good example of this. Rather than turn to PowerPoint, I will now do an on-screen graph for you of the emotional journey of Flower. You play as the wind. You control the breeze, and you are blowing petals through flowers and sort of fertilizing them. And it starts off quite delicate, where you've got one petal, and every time you kind of fertilize more flowers, you get more petals, and you get to be more broad and more grand, and you get this amazing feeling of flight. And that's the emotion that game company wanted to create with this game. They wanted to produce this emotion, the freedom of flight, which is quite a specific thing to go for. And with their control system and with their graphics, they've done a beautiful job. But during the course of the game, there are 6 levels. You sort of build up very slowly. Here comes the graph. Build up very slowly, this kind of sense of freedom. You get more strength, more speed. You get sort of power-ups and things. You get a sort of increasing sense of freedom as you go through the game. And about 2/3 of the way through, for the first time, you can actually be damaged. You're basically invincible, and there is no time limit on anything for the first 2/3 of the game. But then level 4, there's a nighttime level with these electrical pylons that can sort of shock you. And they really are. It's a big surprise when something hurts you for the first time, 2/3 of the way through the game. And you suddenly have to start kind of crawling very slowly through blades of grass and being incredibly careful with your flight again after this sort of acceleration of freedom for the first 2/3. You suddenly have to become very careful, and it's very restricted. But then when you get through that level, you are into this sort of urban landscape where you become incredibly powerful. Your little cloud of petals can blow through metal pylons. You can knock buildings over. You can totally transform whole skyscrapers, and you're supercharged for that last level. So in terms of the emotion, if we have, I guess, time along this axis and emotion up here, your sense of freedom of flight kind of goes up like that. Then it has a very jagged period over here where you're failing and dying a bit, and then you're suddenly supercharged at the end, and you peak, and that's the beautiful finish of Flower. And I realized that emotional curve, which is it's really a difficulty curve of kind of building up and then being restricted in your emotion and then being rewarded for it, it's kind of a basic building block of storytelling. And with this, when you start seeing it in terms of emotion, you realize it's very similar across many different types of story. If it was a horror game or a horror story, you'd have the similar thing of it being like slightly creepy, slightly, you're getting that excitement of that adrenaline building up, and then it's like, holy fuck, I'm dying, this is horrible. And then you release, you escape, you get that great kind of buzz, and that's what horror games are all about. And that's that particular emotion that they're going for. So with that in mind, if you're trying to create an emotional effect, then I started looking at what really creates emotion. What are the non-verbal cues that we pick up, whether we're really looking for them or not? What are the tools that a storyteller can use to create emotion in ways that are non-verbal? And the example I like to use for this is if you get a letter in the post. And most of the letters I get these days are bills or junk mail. But if you get an actual letter, then you pick up a lot of emotional information from it before you even open the envelope. I mean, is it addressed to you by name? Was it delivered by hand or by a postman? Is the postmark domestic or international? Is it first class letter? Was it franked? Was it stamped? Is it on really kind of thick paper or something really thin? Is it a postcard rather than a letter? Is it perfumed? Is it handwritten? And does the handwriting have character? What color is the ink that they've written on? And that's before you even get into the text of the letter, because so much of the emotional power of a story is actually in the medium rather than in the message. And when you start thinking about it in these terms, in these kind of emotional terms, you realize that actually you can kind of bypass the brain quite a lot. And again, having come from a very wordy sort of intellectual education, this is it took a bit of a shift for me to adjust to this. But I think it's actually a very powerful thought, at least, to have in mind. And it's something that's come up again and again in the work that I've done since then. One example I might use is a game I made with Hartswood Films, who are the guys who make Sherlock, the TV series. And I ended up working on an interactive episode of Sherlock. So effectively it was an app, a game, where you join Sherlock's homeless network and you become one of his kind of informants, you're kind of doing legwork for him, and as the game goes on, you become more and more of a detective, more and more of a kind of integral, important part of the investigation. And the way that we made this particular app is we used a lot of video. The show stars Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman and Mark Gatiss, and we got all of them on camera, and we shot basically a whole original story on the sets of a TV show and using the original cast. But one change that we made was all the video was shot in first person, very much as I'm speaking to you now. The characters address you directly. You are, there are no gendered pronouns in the game, so you play as you, no matter what your gender is. You're not named. You can upload your own Facebook ID photo as your sort of icon in the game. So it feels like you are playing as you, and they are talking to you through your phone or your tablet. They're leaving you FaceTime messages, voicemails, text messages. And it had a very particular emotional effect on the audience. About 2 hours after we launched the game, we were all just keeping an eye on Twitter to see what was happening. And the first message that came through was a complaint. It was somebody on Twitter saying that the major problem with playing with this game is that they kept blushing. Every time Benedict Cumberbatch looked at them, they blushed. Every time he sort of whispered in their ear, they sort of went to pieces. And we got a lot of messages like that. People saying that, his voice was very powerful and that they were all going a bit weak at the knees. And these are people who've watched, every single episode of Sherlock on TV. They know the characters incredibly well. It's not like this is the first time they've ever met this character. But the fact that it was first person, the fact that it was directed at them, all we've done basically is move the camera, and it created a very, very different emotional effect. And even within the first person video stuff, we managed to create certain sort of nuances and character. All of Sherlock's pieces are kind of filmed like this, really. It's sort of static camera, quite centered, quite composed, more composed than I am, beautifully scripted, obviously, because I wrote it. But it's very kind of controlled, and that's very Sherlock. Whereas John Watson's pieces tend to be very handheld. We actually got him using the producer's iPhone to record his pieces, and he would just sort of memorize his script, run off, record himself, and come back and show us what he got. And because it was much more shaky and handheld and sort of slightly closer up because his arm's only so long, it made it feel much more personal and much more intimate. And that's John's character. He's a bit more sort of, I guess, shaky and human, as opposed to Sherlock, who is kind of distant and intellectual and in control a lot of the time. So we realized that, these sort of subtleties of how you use media carry a lot of emotional and sometimes almost subliminal messaging beyond what the characters actually say on screen or beyond what the text of a message might be. And there are certainly ways you can manipulate that. In another project I did, I was trying to communicate the sort of thorny social issue of the lack of social housing in the UK. This project was called Meet Lucy, and it had two parts to it. It was developed as part of Learn, Do, Share, which is a conference run by Lance Weiler. And the sort of aim of the whole event was to create social change through the use of media. And in order to communicate this rather sort of long-term, not very sexy problem of people being stuck in limbo, if they sort of fall off the property ladder, if they can't afford their rent anymore, they get put in government social housing, but there's a huge lack of it in the UK, and people are supposed to be in there for like a maximum of 6 weeks, and then they find them somewhere to live. Instead, we've got whole families living in these shelters or converted bed and breakfast places for like a year or two at a time, and they're trapped, and it is heartbreaking, but it also not very dramatic. It is tedious. It is boring. That sense of just being stuck is quite hard to dramatize and quite hard to communicate. This is why it's not headline news every night, because there's no action. It's just a lot of people sitting, getting bored. And to try and turn that into an exciting story was a challenge. But we did it in two ways. There were two elements to the story. One was in the 6 weeks before the Learn, Do, Share event, we set up a kind of automated system for messaging, taking text messages and emails. If you sent Lucy a message, then she would basically start a conversation for you over the next 6 weeks, talking about her experience of her and her family who'd just been landed in one of these shelters. So it just gave you a 6-week experience of what it was like for her and her everyday life, and the opportunities she missed out on, the struggles with her family, those kind of slow burning problems that could only really be told in real time, to give you that sense of how this issue just keeps going on, even when you're not looking at it, even when you're not thinking about it. Somebody is having to deal with these problems all the time. The second part of the story, we actually built a VR installation using Oculus Rift. There's a guy called Robert Andre, who's a graduate student at Ravensbourne, and he not only sort of built the digital side, if you like, of this immersive installation, which was a recreation of the accommodation where Lucy and her family were living. He also built this sort of frame that went around it, which included heating that was triggered by hot areas in the virtual space, and there were scent triggers as well. So if you walked through a kitchen, you might feel the oven going hot against your leg. You might smell sort of strong curry smells we were using to get this kind of quite oppressive sense of almost like sensory overload. And the sort of rooms themselves were quite low ceilings. They had quite small windows. It felt very claustrophobic, and that was absolutely the emotion that we wanted to create. And another useful factor really was with Oculus Rift, people sometimes get a sense of sort of motion sickness, or they get a little bit seasick wearing the helmet. And in our case, that's exactly the kind of emotion we wanted to engender. So the medium really enforced the message. Within 2 or 3 minutes, people were like, oh yeah, I get the idea. That's a really horrible place. I wouldn't want to live there. And so between these two different media, between the sort of long-term text messaging campaign and the VR, we created very specific emotions. We wanted to get that sense of long-term ennui, if you like, by using a real-time text messaging system that would sort of interfere with your everyday life. And then this very focused, very concentrated sense of claustrophobia we created through VR. And again, it was a campaigning message. It was trying to attract attention to this problem, and the emotional impact was far more powerful than me going on about how there are 80,000 children in sheltered accommodation at the moment, because it's the emotion that sticks with people, and that's what I hope will lead to some change. Anybody who went through that process will remember it. So with all that in mind, I have a bit of a, clearly this is a bit of a hobby horse for me. I like getting people to think about the emotional nuances of media. And so my challenge for you, your little task to do in the next 5 minutes, is go to your email and look at the top message in your inbox, and kind of ignoring the text, look at everything in that message and figure out, what are the emotional cues here? What's going on? How are people trying to manipulate your emotions in this? What font are they using? What's maybe the subtleties of the language? Maybe they call you Mr. or Mrs. or Miss rather than calling you by your first name. What are the subtle emotional cues that you pick up from this message, apart from the text itself? And just use this as a way of becoming hyper aware of the emotional cues that are in every message everywhere, because once you learn to understand those, then you can use them yourself, and you can create a much greater emotional impact in your own work. That's all from me.